Just firstly again, thank you for being to do this. And today we really just want to talk about you and your work, the journey between you and your work, how you got to become this local scientist. I suppose the first thing is if you could just please give us a brief summary of you.
Of me? What sort of biography you want?
The biography you want to tell.
Well, it's a hard one to say how I become me. I guess my journey starts here in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Bellville. And if I think about where I am now, I think most of it has always been about the beginnings and growing up in South Africa, growing up there, and leaving to go to Australia, and that was probably, and this was around 1985, when we had a lot of the riots, unsettled schooling, but we left with our parents. My dad had gotten a job offer to go and work there for 3 years as a contract. But I think there was something else to his motivation for going as well, and it had to do with race and employment. But that's something we found out much later. Only now, because they don't tell stories.
Yes.
Yeah, and they keep those stories. They don't know. They're not for us. So if I have to think about the key thing for me, it had been after going to Australia, I had become heavily invested in wanting to know more about the place that I come from. So there was that sort of dislocation. So I consumed literature about South African politics in my first 2-3 years of living there, and it become really politicized over in Australia. In Australia, we were actively involved in young people, and you know, every day there would be riots, there would be boycotts, and people wouldn't go to school. So it became normalized, and so you participate, and you know that there's something wrong. There's SAPO Sports Council, campus schools, no normal sport, apartheid society, those sorts of things. But for me, some of the turning points, and I think there's multiple turning points, was that going to Australia and having to think about that I didn't actually want to be there. I wanted to be back. I wanted to be back here, but I couldn't be back here without having something to bring back. So I ended up investing in learning academic English, because Afrikaans was my first language, and reading and researching our history. That was that was one of the main transitions. But all of those sorts of things then happened in relation to having to also make and understand what it was going to mean for me to live in Australia. A very different place, a very white place, where black bodies were so few in the 80s, and they had just developed and come out of assimilation and stuff for 10-20 years, and they had these policies of multicultural. But we ended up playing sport with the British and so on, and experiencing the racism on the soccer fields and things like that. So it is a very similar place in lots of ways, but we also thought, when people ask me there about racism, I said, well, in South Africa they actually just tell you that they're racist. In Australia they pretend that they're not. You see lots of
But they show you that they
show you that they are. They behave in ways that. So there's things like that. So for me the kernel, the key motivator had always been that I had reached, or I'd come to a particular point in the Australian context, was that I'm going to now study so that I can make some contribution back in South Africa. So that was always the plan. So I became a teacher, and then I said, no, I can't actually go back as a teacher because we don't have enough teachers. So this is when I started to do research about South African identities. I looked at what knowledges are available about that tells about the experiences of South Africa, like mine or South African South Africa when they leave.
Yes.
And you find very little in the literature. I mean, if any. And even when people had written about black people's experiences, it come from such a deficit, horrible deficit orientation. Constructiveness as leading, or even when they weren't constructed, they were absent. Yes. But I also thought, so I did this study for my fourth, and then I just did a survey because I wanted to ask people, South Africans, and I was so colonized myself that I used the language of, I struggled with Afrikaans because people had attached Afrikaans to Afrikaners, and I always said that they can't claim the language in that way because it doesn't belong to them. They didn't develop. A lot of people contributed to developing this language.
Yes.
And I was worried. I wanted to go back, but I did a fourth year study where I wanted to look at what are the experiences of, I said, non-white South Africans. Oh my God. So I sent the survey out through networks and whatever else to find out what are the factors that influence the South African people's experiences. And then I got this feedback. Someone saying, I'm not going to participate in this because you use the oppressor's language. I said, thank you, but don't.
Yeah.
And then another one came back and they said, I mean, how could you put white as the center here, non-white, so when you are just reproducing? I thought, but how did I get myself into this position that I'm now also seen as someone that's producing and complicit in producing particular types of knowledge?
Yes.
And it was it was a really disconcerting experience, but a really important one for me to be able to now see that, I mean, through language and through particular sorts of things that you are already doing things that produces power relationships, small signifiers, small things like that. And that was for my fourth year project.
Okay.
And it's since that time that I've been just looking at doing the migration stuff, and at the same time when I was teaching, it was about I was teaching and people found me a novelty because it was black culture in white schools.
So you're a bit of an exhibition.
A bit of a cool guy.
Yeah.
For the kids, not in a harmful way, because they're young people. Well, this person doesn't look like anyone else, but that says more something about the society.
I wanted to ask, isn't it just because it's a novelty, like you said, it's new to them to see?
Yeah, and they like Magic Johnson. They like, they idolize.
Okay. So. And looking at your areas of research, well, okay, I'm just trying to process all this, but there's a very strong focus on that. And a very strong focus on displacement. And I want to ask, and it's a very personal one, but in doing this work, was it also a bit of a journey of self-discovery?
It was maybe more self-construction as opposed to self-discovery. It was about, so even learning about South Africa was learning about you. We are so enmeshed and become so socialized into this. It was for me a journey of, and at least for me, a journey of self-construction. And reconstruction. And we have to continue to remake this self. All the experiences, even the research experiences that I have, takes me to a different place. I'm not at that same place anymore. I go through these journeys. And your perspective on the world changes. My perspective has shifted from 10 years ago and even before that to where I am now, and how I look at things, how I see myself, and where I see myself, because I can see myself belonging here, and I can see myself belonging in Australia, but I can feel quite comfortable in other places as well. So it's a way of undoing the things that govern us, that locks us into wanting to only be this or be something else.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. But now I'm wondering, and this is maybe very crude simplification, but how do you manage being part of this community here, the South African community here, and then still being so vested in the Australian community?
Vested. How do I manage to be proud of? What's driving this question? No.
I'm just wondering, maybe I can clarify, it's just reading through some of the work as well, and speaking to you now, there is a sense of, I want to go here, but that I am here, and this is where I'm working and where I am. And there are two different drivers in this community.
There are two different drivers. I think, I mean, look, I've never not wanted to be in South Africa. I mean, it's always been my aspiration that if I'm not going to be physically here, I'm going to be here in some other way. And I think that's probably reflected in it. And in terms of re-articulating and making and constructing meaningful work in an Australian context, it's always been what is it about our community, the place that I've come from, and how I can think about oppression, exclusion, race, and all those sorts of things. How might that be articulated or re-articulated in the Australian context? So, in the Academy of Voices, I'm in the Australian psychology. It's a multicultural society, but it's a monological psychology. A monocultural psychology and a monological psychology. So it's, I mean, what are the sorts of resources that I bring to this? I've had an opportunity to actually work through. Yes, I've got an agenda. I've got a political agenda. Just to create speaking positions for us to feed back into that, and through that process, there's other voices that can transform the exclusion of sorts of psychology that we know.
And that just brings me to another question, which is psychological training. Because psychology aspires to be the science, constantly espouses value neutral, politically neutral, objective as a research process. But I get the sense that your investment, your drive, the push behind what you do comes from having political considerations, having that motivation and political agenda. Can we have a psychology course?
According to me, I don't think. I mean, I would probably be in the constructionist sort of zone that we can have a neutral psychology. And I think, I mean, even Martin Garou and others say that you can't be dispassionate. And objectivity doesn't have to be value neutrality. It doesn't have to be that we can't play in the space of a social reality. So I don't buy the objectivity, but I think you can be rigorous in your work. You can be rigorous in your work, and you can show how you produce knowledge and how you can account for those sorts of things. But you can't be a dispassionate observer, because even the tools that we construct is a particular lens of the world. Even experimentation is a lens. I mean, people are cultural beings. And academics are part of that. They produce knowledge, they construct means to produce knowledge. That in itself are constructions. So the idea of objectivity is that things are always constructed. To say that there is this object, this reality that you can observe and name and so forth, and it's always going to be partial. It's always going to be a tangent.
Then, what are the constant tensions with critical psychologists is acquiring power, understanding it, or rather standing in power leads to acquiring something. Now, which can, as you said earlier, lead to inadvertently reproducing unfair discriminatory power structures. How do you, as a person, how do you manage the tension between needing to depower yourself so that others may be empowered, and understanding the power dynamics, being a powerful person?
Well, I don't know. I think there's maybe a bit of a, my jury is going out on the depowerment and empowerment. I think I started to think that I've got to invest in my own scrutiny of my own political, my location. I've got to find ways that I can use the opportunities. If I say that I want to depower myself, I think I'm probably going to do a disservice. Because I'm not. That's really. There's something difficult about the depowerment and empowerment dichotomy. I think that ends up being too simplistic, and it ends up assuming a whole series of things about the types of power, the types of ways in which we can give things up. It's almost like jumping up onto a particular sort of high ground as well, and I think I'm quite suspicious about those claims, and I'm quite suspicious about community psychologists' claims around empowerment. In fact, so much of what we do, what we don't do, and if we unreflexively promote that sort of discourse, we as community psychologists, we get privilege, we say we are doing these sorts of things, and I've got a real big problem with that, with it at this time. So some of the things that I've written, for example, when I started around empowerment business, I went to the Centre for Aboriginal Studies, for example, and I had a story to tell, a South African story, and I said that how can I tell a story about oppression in other people? I said, I don't know how to do this. And so they just started asking me questions and talk about their sorts of realities. But it was about saying that we've learned all about empowerment. How am I going to empower everyone? And ever since that time, I've had this really uncomfortable relationship with this particular concept. So then it has changed into thinking about the connections between power and identity, and the fact that it's always there when you do research, when you do work. So, and that was about then interrogating the politics of location and the politics of representation. So those two things, they always have to be there when I do it. Who am I in relation to the people that I'm working with? And what are the sorts of things that I bring with me that I constantly need to think about? And that's why identity is so central.
Touching on who are you in relation to the other people that you work with?
Yes.
Who are those people that working from the belief that there are others around you who support you and contribute to you? Who are your supporters?
Look, I've developed a really solid group of colleagues, but my wife also, I speak with her a lot about these things. She's also an immigrant, she's from Latin America originally. And so we speak about these sorts of things, we reflect on it. So there's one support right there at home.
You're a psychologist.
At home, it's a reflective partner in a way, you know. But then there's also a colleague, the person that I did my supervision, that my thesis with, Adrian Fisher, had always been a supporter. And when I went to Perth, I worked with a number of Indigenous scholars who I learned about some of the protocols and ways of being and some of the sorts of challenges. And there were other colleagues also, community psychologists, who I've developed trusting relationships with. And also in the international spaces, like Isaac played a role earlier because he was also in Victoria, but he had some relationship to my thesis. And then there's other people that I've developed networks with, including Maritza and there's Maria Olga, Reyes Cruz in Puerto Rico. But we found each other, I guess, at the similar symposium where we are talking about identity matters. Yeah. And then there's some people the relationships just continue. And then there's some colleagues who I work with in other countries. I've got a very broad international network of people. I mean, I just reconnected with Todd Sloan at this conference in Barcelona, so I'll share things with him quite openly because And I guess the other really, really significant and central group of people would be Garth and Norman. And I've been coming back to South Africa for years. Norman and Garth were based at UNISA when I first came, but I also came while Mohammed Sidak was there. It was my way of how am I going to stay connected to this. And I came to South Africa to one of the critical psychology conferences, an anti-Osisa conference, and spoke about indigenous stuff even then, and it felt odd speaking about it. And this was in 2000 or before that, I can't remember. But when I came back to South Africa to that critical psychology conference one time, it was a sort of a weird experience because I thought I was going to see some interesting things at this conference, and then I wrote this reflective piece saying that, why isn't anyone talking about the people living in Wentworth? All the friends that I knew in Perth, they were talking about Wenties and saying it was a great place. And when I came to see Wentworth, it was a slum.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. That is.
And I said, so what is it that they romanticized about life in this place? What are they doing? And there was none of that at this conference. It was really just high theory. So I said, well, what is it psychology, critical psychology actually does? And there's none of these stories at this year. Why isn't the academy connected with how people's lives are? So I wrote something like that, and that was just still a sort of another sort of a turning point. And so that's what's kept me trying to figure out, finding ways of being anchored in the ground, and then being able to use high theory and whatever, not to have this massive gap between them. So it's always that, and so that's something that's in me. That's what I have to negotiate and find ways. How do I externalize this?
Okay, so you're speaking about that tension between the grave theory and the romanticized grass. And what are some of the little tricks that you need to do there? Well, you said you keep contact with people and so on. Yeah, but other ways to
a lot of the research things that I've done have always been quite close to it. It's always been, I go into the field, I go and do the interviews, I go and spend time with people. I'm going to hang out a lot. I do that because I think there's so much that you can learn, and I think we want to do experiments and all those sorts of things, but the mundane, the everyday, how people live their lives, and seeing what people do, experiencing their spaces and their places, and speaking with them about those sorts of things is such an important way of just understanding how people are living and making lives within social systems and institutions. So anchoring and being grounded is really important, but I read, like it's going out of fashion, I read and read to see and find the sorts of things that I used to, like chemically. I hardly read psychology. Like, there's every now and then that I will find something that's nice in psychology that's relevant.
So then what do you read?
I read very, very broadly. The critical race stuff. I'm interested in the post-colonial sorts of literatures. I read the American Journal of Community Psychology, but every now and then there's an interesting special edition. I like the things out of Europe, where I read the Journal of Community Applied Psychology, if I read in those areas. Then there's culture and psychology, then race, ethnicity and migration, and all the interdisciplinary journals that really, because those journals are concerned with migration as a topic, or displacement, or racism. They really target it. Community psychology has got a whole host of things that they are interested in. And because it's so open and inclusive, you have to fill it in with things that can make it solid and strong. So that's why it's, and I love methodology. Even the Denzen's qualitative handbook of those sorts of books, but I like the work that Michelle Fine does for the critical research that she does. That's excellent. And feminism and psychology, Yeah, theories. And so those places, there's just so much there that's rich and critical and challenging. But
then you find it. Do you find that you need this sampling across the board to be able to do what you want?
yes, I do. But I also find quite it's personally rewarding to be able to do that. But I do feel like we have to read across interdisciplinary because of the types of issues that we are dealing with. They are not always so that's why there's always this push for either people will call it psychopolitical or psychosocial or psychosocial political. Something. There has to be some way of connecting all these layers and finding ways that we can actually write about, theorize about, but understand, to the extent that we're able to.
What non-academic texts do you, whether it's movies, art?
Oh God, I'm a movie buff. I can watch films, but it's nothing fancy. Not like art house or anything. Anything. I can watch movies. I really love watching movies. I read a lot of South African literature. The last one I read, maybe a while ago, there was an Afrikaans book, Fatma, but I haven't. And it was a really great story. It's a really complex story. So that was the last one. But now I'm reading something on the Spanish history of Spain as a tortured, troubled place as well because of their civil wars and the silence around their massacres.
Yes.
So I'm reading the many massacres. So I'm reading a little bit about that. It's quite hard going, and I'm reading it because I just visited, so I wanted to understand a little bit more about that history. I've read a lot of stuff around, like Eduardo Galeano's book on 500 years of pillage, the open veins of Latin America. So learning about colonialism, the colonial expansion, and the damage, and then and the sorts of challenges for Latin America. So this is 500 years of how do you undo 500 years of exploitation and sucking out wealth and building up? So I don't know. But anyway, I've digressed a bit. But those are the sorts of books. But they're not academic books. They're actually journalists who write political pieces about different countries.
Do you find that stepping outside of the academic frame of thinking
best? So I just think I have to, because the way that I find inspiration is at the margins, man, at the edges, because otherwise I can't. If I don't feel a tension, then I can't write. There's nothing to resolve. You know, there's nothing to articulate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of writing, what are your quirky little writing rituals that you have?
My quirky little writing rituals. My quirky little writing rituals is that, I think Isaac even said one of the things that you must do is just write every day. It doesn't matter what you write. So I write emails. So I'm writing every day, but it wasn't that type of writing. I don't know if this I always admire people who can do these concept maps and draw things out like that. I have to process things in my head a lot and then make it fall into a place. But I'm not someone who can draw the maps that this belongs there, this is. But I've got more this thing that I've got to process, and when it's ready, then I can sit and I can draft it later. So it's not a writing thing, but it's more of it's more of and when I'm like that, then I can't speak with people. It's like I'm busy. I'm really busy processing things. That's how people know me like that, because I'll be over the weekend. I'll be thinking, and then maybe Monday morning if I start, and then I can't be disturbed just until that thing is being processed. But so I don't know if there's anything quirky about the writing. The things that I would
I would be thinking and might not be able to find it, and then I would go, I'll read some stuff. I'll have to read some stuff just to see where there might be a connection. And once that's made, then I can run it again. So but the writing to me is, I think it is always an internal process before it can happen.
What I do like what you're saying is that it's not a magic moment where you just sit down and
no, it's sometimes it's a difficult thing, and I spend a lot of time in the train as well. So I'd be sitting on the, when I go to work, it's an hour at least to get there. So there's a lot of time to just think about the sorts of things that I do. And now what I've done also in terms of writing is I've got students that I've always wanted to include in the writing process. I've tried to structure so if they want to do a thesis, and I know that they will be confident, and I say that for this thesis you have to think about this is something that you need to write up, so that they always are also thinking that we're going to turn this into for people to have that there is that expectation. Sometimes it can be overwhelming for people, and sometimes it's not. That is really just planting the seed that we're going to do this. We're going to be able to write it. You send a book, it might be rejected, but it's your. If you're invested in this sort of work, you feel this. You feel this work. It's not. You're not writing it because you have to get a publication. For us, this work really is about writing politically. You want to change something or want to comment on something.
well, is there anything you want to talk about? This is also a conversation as much as it is an interview.
Well, I mean, is there anything I want to talk about?
So you can market your projects if you like.
I could market the projects that we do. I mean, I'm quite excited about the work that we're going to be doing in Melbourne. I can just see me stretched in all sorts of directions at the moment. But we've got one of the things that I've created, or that I've had a hand in creating in Melbourne, based on what Garth and Norman Yep at the back after was to sell to my school the idea that we needed a structure, a mechanism within which our colleagues can work together to produce research, public engagement around the topics of significance in Melbourne's Western science. So we've developed a research that we call community identity and displacement research links. And so one of the first initiatives that we've got is a conference that's coming up in November around place and displacement, with the themes of identity, community, and at transformations, mobilities, migration, exclusion, and all of those sorts of things. And it's an interdisciplinary conference because all of the issues that we're concerned with, racism, are of significance to sociologists, historians, psychologists, some side. So that's the one initiative. So that's something that I'm quite excited about, because it has brought together the historians, politicians, the cultural studies, the gender studies, the psychology people. We're all going to work together on producing work at our university that is of relevance to our community, that's socially responsible. The Apartheid Archive project, I don't need to say anything about that, but I think that is always going to be an important project for me, and I always want to be involved in it. My agenda, or my sort of interest in it, will be about being able to get more stories at one level, but the project itself, the transformative capacity, the sorts of thinking that we need to do to articulate and take it to the vision that we have. We still have a number of things, theoretical, epistemological things to do to be able to do that. So it's almost a praxis sort of dimension. Then I've got this work that I've been doing in Western Australia and also in Melbourne, which is about the role of community arts, which has become very popular. So all forms of but this is all forms of arts-based participation, from music, drumming, um, theatre, photography, in particular, visual methodologies. So, and other people have been doing this, but governments are quite interested in it because people have been arguing that it's good for people's health, it's good for education, it's good for a whole series of things. So some people have psychologized it a little bit and individualized it, but others are saying, oh look, there's a stronger political agenda to the art stuff about engagement, about community, about inclusion, about being able to express ideas and imagine. So anyway, so I'm working not as someone that's looking at necessarily at the arts, but I'm interested in looking at how can this, how is this mobilized to bring different communities of people together, and what are the ways in which identities are being reconstructed and negotiated through those processes. How does this allow us to think about race, to think through race relations in very everyday spaces? So the arts is just a vehicle, and the outcomes are okay, but I'm interested in. So one of the projects that we did now that the student has just talked right up to was about young people who had to tell stories, or who talked to older people about telling stories. So it's a storytelling project, but also across ethnic communities and so on. So it's creating a space where people will tell stories, and then these people took this very project and went to an indigenous community to do storytelling as a way to say that people have a whole series of things to experience and do similar things that are concerned with. So there's a way of looking at how do you, from the ground up, or you create spaces where people can construct, and challenge, and create Australian identities.
Without using the mundane things that really do construct.
Yeah, without exactly that everyday ways in which people make meaning. It's a simple thing, and I think this is what they do. So I really like that because it is so powerful. We don't have to create artificial conditions to understand. So there's the arts, the arts sorts of things, but it's always around race and identity anyway, or identities. Then there's the place in this place which is really the migration-oriented work, and it's not only migration-oriented work, it's internal migrations, global, transnational, it's all sorts of movements, forced, involuntary.
But it also just include sort of cultural abilities of this place. You're not necessarily physically displaced.
That's right.
Displaced.
Yeah. And the immobile displaced, because we've got all sorts of gentrification, where people's suburbs around them are being transformed. It's not the suburb that I grew up in. It doesn't look the same anymore. So there are displaced within the very place there where they've lived. So it doesn't look the same. How do we deal with this? And there's so many communities, and this is part even in Melbourne, I'm sure here as well, because the inner city is becoming popular again, but it squeezes all the people that used to live there out because it becomes too expensive to actually live in those places. So there's those sorts of displacements as well. So we're interested in that, and then I think this other thing, I've got ongoing commitments all over the place. But I think those are the three things that I'm going to have to concentrate on. When I go back to work now, I will have to lead some sort of program of work around mobility transitions and migrations as an area. And I think, so those are
the three big things that you...
They are gigantic things. I've got about we've got another project that we've got a postdoc on, and this was about the ways in which young people engage in everyday peace building. So we've got data from three places. Now this postdoc that she's moved on, also we've got data we've gathered data in Australia at two sites. Young people involved in United Nations activity, what peace building, peace making means for them. We've got
today.
Then we've got another site was Laos.
Yes.
And in Laos, we interviewed young people who are working also for some sort of World Vision program, and they were looking at issues to do with child labor and understanding child labor, preventing or doing education on child labor and education. So we were going to do another a lot of data collection in Colombia, but that's going to have to wait now. But this is about diversity and peace, but all the different ways. Yeah, it shows the way in which young people are actually engaged in peaceful community making. So that's another project that I'm working on with a colleague called Shu Fang, who's a peace psychologist. That's a big one as well. Then we've got. Huh?
I'm just wondering, where do you sleep?
I don't. I don't know. I found my wife tells me that she asks us, I guess. I don't know. I always work. But I said that well, it's not really work. It's just sort of a lifestyle. It's a way of living. So I don't actually see it as work because academia is like that. You're always engaged, but I haven't experienced it as different. As a burden, I've loved it. I mean, I've just been. So the other project is working with the people in Italy.
Yes.
And they're doing also migration-related things. But that one is really just working with them on looking at migration and translations and understanding of citizenship and migration. Oh my God! No, I can't tell you about all the other ones because I will just then you know how overstretched I am. So. Well, it is that migration team, and there's different people that I work with.
That is very consistent with all of the projects that you're working on.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm going to say thank you. I know we can keep on
We can keep on to
about a lot. I will not ask you about the spear painting, even though I wanted to. Zoom the spear painting and the reaction that's had.
Which one?
The Zumba spear painting. Where
the thing
the gentle yes. That also touches on your everyday understanding.
Yeah. And what people actually communicating there, how people responded quite differently. And what the artist had in mind with that. Because sometimes people say, well, art, people will interpret whatever they want to, but you're doing it because there's something you want to show. I don't know how people see this from a distance, and from the Australian context. The way that media filters, projects images, makes it unsophisticated and uncomplicated, and they don't. It's removed from context. So in Australia, all you hear is about this particular painting, but they would also have attached like a Zuma to polygamy and all these other things. So we get very, very simplistic messages of art. And I'm always cautious and like you can't go to judgment. You need to understand more, do a little bit of digging, and then offer something.
I think that's it. Also many other people.
Well, God, I hope that's what you wanted, eh?